Welcome to Life Stories, where extraordinary journeys remind us of the power of courage, empathy, and the connection we share with the world around us. Today, we bring you the story of Jake, a man whose life changed forever during a hike through the untamed wilderness of Colorado. What began as a quest to capture nature's beauty through his camera turned into an unforgettable adventure of survival, trust, and guardianship. Join us as we explore Jake's incredible bond with the forest and the guardian bears who taught him the meaning of true harmony. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to begin today's story. Jake Parker adjusted the straps of his well-worn backpack and paused to take in the vast expanse of wilderness stretched before him. The early morning sun poured over the Colorado Rockies, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain. The peaks and valleys seemed to glow with hues of gold and green, the kind of beauty that stops you in your tracks and leaves you breathless. Jake inhaled deeply, savoring the crisp mountain air laced with the faint scent of pine and damp earth. For Jake, these solitary hikes were more than just a pastime, they were a refuge, a way to escape the relentless noise of the world. He had always been drawn to the wild, where time seemed to flow differently, measured not by deadlines or appointments but by the rise and fall of the sun and the whispers of the wind through the trees. Armed only with his camera and an insatiable curiosity, Jake sought not just to see nature but to understand it, to capture moments so authentic they seemed to breathe. Today's destination was a remote ridge he had meticulously researched over weeks. It was said to offer unparalleled views of the valley below. But that wasn't what intrigued Jake most. This ridge was rumored to be home to elusive wildlife, creatures rarely seen by human eyes. Jake envisioned capturing a single shot so striking it would tell its own story, perhaps one that might even grace the cover of a nature magazine. The thought filled him with a quiet excitement. The trail beneath his boots was uneven, the gravel crunching with every step. The silence of the forest was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. Jake paused now and then to snap a photo, a towering pine stretching toward the sky, the delicate play of sunlight on a moss-covered rock. Each step felt purposeful, a journey not just into the wild but into the extraordinary. As the trail narrowed and climbed higher, the landscape began to shift. The trees grew sparser, the ground rockier, and to his right, the drop-off became increasingly precarious. Jake moved carefully, aware of how one misstep could spell disaster. Yet, the thrill of being so close to nature's raw edge kept him moving forward. Suddenly, a faint, high-pitched sound broke the quiet, a cry, weak but insistent. Jake stopped in his tracks, his senses sharpening as he scanned the area. The sound came again, more desperate this time. His pulse quickened as he tried to pinpoint its source. Carefully, he stepped closer to the edge, peering over the side. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Just below, on a narrow ledge, a tiny bear cub clung to the rocky outcrop. Its small frame quivered, and its cries echoed faintly against the canyon walls. Jake's eyes widened as he took in the scene. The cub's dark eyes darted around, searching for a way out, but the jagged rocks above and the sheer drop below left no escape. Jake's heart ached at the sight. It was clear the cub had slipped while exploring, perhaps following its mother, who was now nowhere to be seen. The ledge it stood on was barely wide enough to support it, and the violent river far below made the scene even more perilous. Jake felt an intense pang of helplessness mixed with a surge of responsibility. He whispered to himself, "I can't just leave it there." But how could he help without putting himself in danger? Jake's mind raced through possibilities. He reached for his backpack, pulling out a rope he always carried for emergencies. As he tested its strength, he couldn't ignore the growing urgency in the cub's cries. Jake's thoughts turned to the risks. He knew descending the rocky cliff face would be treacherous. The thought of losing his footing, of the rope snapping under his weight, sent a cold wave of fear through him. And yet, the alternative, leaving the cub to its fate, was unbearable. He couldn't stand the idea of it slipping further and plummeting into the roaring river below. Drawing a deep breath, Jake began to prepare. He fashioned a makeshift harness from the straps of his camera gear, tightening each knot with trembling hands. As he worked, doubts crept into his mind, but he pushed them aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. "Stay calm," he murmured to himself. "You can do this." The trail behind him was quiet, the forest still. It felt as though the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what he would do. Jake stepped cautiously to the edge, glancing down at the cub. The distance seemed greater now, the jagged rocks below sharper. His muscles tensed as he began to lower himself, gripping the rope tightly. Each step down the cliff felt like an eternity. Loose pebbles skittered away beneath his boots, tumbling into the depths below. Jake's heart pounded with every movement, the enormity of what he was doing pressing down on him. And yet, with each inch closer to the cub, his resolve strengthened. The cub's cries began to soften as Jake drew nearer. Its tiny body trembled as it pressed against the cold rock wall, its vulnerability cutting through Jake like a knife. In that moment, all his fear was replaced by a singular focus: saving this fragile life. As he clung to the cliff, every muscle taut with effort, Jake felt something shift within him, a deep connection to the wild, to this cub, to the fragile balance of life and survival. It was a moment that would stay with him forever. The world seemed to narrow to the length of the rope, the jagged rocks, and the bear cub's trembling form on the ledge below. Jake's breath came in shallow bursts as he descended carefully, his boots scraping against the rocky cliff face. The river's roar grew louder with each step, its power a constant reminder of the stakes. The cub's small, plaintive cries tugged at Jake's heart, a mixture of desperation and fear that pushed him forward despite the growing ache in his arms and legs. When he was just a few feet away, the cub stopped crying. Its wide, dark eyes locked onto Jake, and for a moment, the two were frozen in a fragile silence. The cub's tiny body was pressed against the cliff wall, as if trying to disappear into the rock. Jake paused, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay, little one. I'm here to help." He wasn't sure if the cub could understand his words, but he hoped it could sense the gentleness in his tone. Slowly, he reached into the small pouch strapped to his side and pulled out a cloth sling he had improvised earlier. The cub flinched at the motion, its tiny paws scrabbling against the rock in panic. Jake froze, murmuring softly to calm the frightened animal. "You're okay. I've got you." His movements were painstakingly slow as he edged closer. The ledge beneath his boots felt alarmingly unstable, crumbling slightly under his weight. Jake's muscles burned from the effort of holding his position, but he kept his focus on the cub. Finally, he was close enough to reach out. The cub shivered as Jake gently touched its fur. It felt coarse under his fingers, a stark contrast to the soft vulnerability in the animal's gaze. The cub let out a small whimper, but it didn't struggle. Jake took this as a sign of trust, or perhaps exhaustion, and carefully wrapped the sling around its trembling body. "Almost there," Jake whispered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Securing the sling around his chest, Jake tested the knots one last time before preparing to ascend. That was when he heard it, a sharp crack that echoed through the canyon. For a moment, Jake's heart stopped. The sound came from above, where his rope was anchored to a sturdy pine tree. He glanced up, his grip tightening instinctively. A loose rock had given way, sending a small cascade of pebbles tumbling past him. Though the anchor held firm, the reminder of how precarious his situation was sent a jolt of fear through him. The cub let out a soft cry, pressing itself closer to Jake's chest. He took a deep breath, willing himself to stay calm. "We're going up," he murmured, more to himself than the cub. One step at a time. The ascent was agonizingly slow. Every pull of the rope sent a sharp pain through Jake's shoulder, his muscles screaming in protest. The weight of the cub against his chest made the climb even more difficult. But Jake refused to let go. His focus was razor-sharp. His thoughts reduced to the rhythm of his breathing and the feel of the rope beneath his hands. As he climbed, Jake's mind flickered with doubts. What if the rope didn't hold? What if the cub's mother appeared, mistaking him for a threat? The fear was suffocating. But each time it threatened to overwhelm him. Jake looked down at the small bundle pressed against him. The cub's vulnerability reminded him why he couldn't stop. Why he couldn't fail. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake hoisted himself and the cub over the edge of the cliff. He collapsed onto solid ground, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. For a moment, he couldn't move, his body trembling from exhaustion and relief. The cub whimpered softly, still secured in the sling. Jake sat up slowly, unfastening the makeshift harness and placing the cub gently on the ground. It stumbled slightly, its legs weak from fear and exhaustion. But its eyes were wide with curiosity as it looked up at him. For a long moment, Jake and the cub simply stared at each other. In its gaze, Jake saw something that took him by surprise, a cautious trust. As if the cub understood what he had done. Jake leaned back against a tree, his body aching but his heart full. He had done it. He had saved the cub. But as he sat there, catching his breath, a new thought crept into his mind. Where was the cub's mother? The forest around him was quiet. Almost unnaturally so. Jake scanned the tree line, his muscles tensing. He knew that if the mother bear appeared now, she might see him as a threat. But there was no sign of her, just the soft rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of the river. Jake exhaled, his relief tempered by a lingering sense of unease. He couldn't stay here forever. The cub needed its mother, and he needed to find a way to reunite them. But for now, he allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The sun was starting to rise higher in the sky, casting a warm light over the forest. As Jake watched the cub take its first tentative steps away from him, his heart swelled with a mix of pride and gratitude. He hadn't planned for this rescue, hadn't even imagined it, but it was a moment he would never forget. This fragile life, saved by his hands, felt like a small miracle. Jake adjusted his backpack, readying himself for the next part of this unexpected journey. Whatever came next, he knew one thing for certain: the wilderness had already changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. As Jake regained his strength, he couldn't shake the uneasy question of where the cub's mother might be. Bears, especially mothers, were fiercely protective of their young. The silence of the forest seemed heavier now, as if the air itself was bracing for something. The cub, still trembling but visibly calmer, stayed close to Jake. Its tiny legs wobbled as it attempted to explore its surroundings. But it would stop every few steps to glance back at him, as if seeking reassurance. Jake felt a strange sense of responsibility for the little creature, a bond he hadn't anticipated. He scanned the tree line again, his senses heightened. Then, from the dense shadows of the forest, a low rustling sound reached his ears. Jake froze, his body instantly alert. The cub, too, turned toward the noise, letting out a small, plaintive cry. The rustling grew louder, and then, emerging from the trees, was a massive figure that made Jake's breath catch. The mother bear stepped into the clearing, her dark fur glistening in the sunlight. She was enormous, her powerful frame moving with deliberate intent. Her sharp eyes immediately locked onto Jake and the cub. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he calculated his next move. Running wasn't an option, bears could outrun humans with terrifying ease. And any sudden movement might provoke her. Instead, Jake stayed completely still, his body rigid with fear. The mother bear advanced slowly, her gaze shifting between Jake and her cub. The cub, sensing its mother's presence, let out a soft cry and stumbled toward her. But Jake's presence complicated the situation. Would she see him as a threat? Jake's instincts screamed at him to retreat. But his legs wouldn't move. The bear stopped just a few feet from her cub, towering over them both. Her posture was tense but not aggressive, as though she were assessing the situation. Jake held his breath, every muscle in his body taut. Then something extraordinary happened. The mother bear leaned down and nudged her cub gently with her nose. The cub responded with a soft whimper, pressing against her side. Jake watched, his fear giving way to awe. The tenderness between them was undeniable, a stark contrast to the ferocious image he'd always associated with bears. But what struck Jake most was the way the mother bear turned her gaze back to him. There was no anger, no hostility in her eyes, only something Jake could only describe as understanding. It was as if she knew what he had done, as if she recognized that he had saved her cub. Jake's chest tightened with emotion. He had always respected nature, but this moment was something deeper, something profoundly humbling. The mother bear, a creature of immense strength and power, was showing a kind of grace he hadn't thought possible. After a long, tense pause, the mother bear turned her attention fully to her cub, gently guiding it back toward the forest. Jake didn't move, didn't dare breathe too loudly, until they disappeared into the trees. But just before vanishing completely, the mother bear stopped and looked back at Jake one last time. Her gaze lingered, filled with an almost human-like quality, a silent acknowledgement that left Jake in awe. Then, with her cub safely at her side, she vanished into the wilderness. Jake remained seated, his body still trembling from the encounter. The fear that had gripped him earlier was gone, replaced by a deep sense of connection. He had heard stories of moments like this, tales of animals and humans crossing paths in ways that defied logic. But to experience it firsthand was something entirely different. As the forest around him returned to its usual rhythm, Jake allowed himself to exhale. He leaned back against the tree, the adrenaline in his veins slowly ebbing. His thoughts were a swirl of emotions: relief, wonder, and an overwhelming gratitude for the chance to witness something so raw and real. The wilderness had always been a place of beauty for Jake, but now it felt like something more. It was alive, filled with moments of grace and connection that most people never got to see. He looked at his hands, still shaking slightly, and realized how small he felt in the face of something so vast and untamed. Eventually, Jake rose, brushing off the dirt from his clothes. He glanced at the spot where the bears had disappeared, a strange longing settling in his chest. Though he didn't know if he'd ever see them again, the encounter had left its mark on him. It was a reminder of the delicate balance between man and nature, of the quiet power of empathy and respect. As Jake began his trek back down the trail, he couldn't help but smile. He had set out that morning in search of a photograph, a fleeting image to capture the beauty of the wild. Instead, he had found something far greater: a story, an experience that would stay with him forever. The wilderness had given him a gift, and for that, Jake knew he would always be grateful. Days after Jake's extraordinary encounter with the mother bear and her cub, he found himself thinking about them constantly. Every rustle of leaves, every faint sound carried by the wind, brought back memories of the way the bear had looked at him, a look that felt more profound than mere instinct. It was as if they had shared something unspoken, a bond forged in that moment of rescue and gratitude. Back at his cabin, perched on the edge of the forest, Jake noticed signs of the bear's presence. Deep claw marks appeared on a tree near his porch, low enough to suggest they were deliberate. He also found small piles of berries and roots neatly arranged on flat stones along his usual trail's offerings. Perhaps, though the thought seemed almost too mystical to believe, still, Jake couldn't shake the sense that the bears were watching over him, a feeling that was both humbling and strangely comforting. But this peace didn't last long. One evening, while Jake was returning from a hike, he noticed something out of place. Tracks, boot prints, deep and heavy, marred the soft earth along the forest path. His heart sank. Humans didn't often venture this deep into the wilderness, and those who did were usually conservationists like himself. But these prints didn't belong to hikers. They were deliberate, purposeful, and they were heading straight toward the heart of the forest. Jake's worst fears were confirmed the next morning when he stumbled upon the remnants of a poacher's camp. Broken branches, scattered bait, and crude traps littered the ground. He felt a surge of anger and despair. The forest, with its delicate balance of life, was now under threat. And worse, the bears, his bears, could be targets. Jake knew he couldn't let this happen. He contacted Sarah Mitchell, a local conservationist and one of the few people who understood his passion for protecting the wilderness. Together, they combed the forest, documenting the damage and carefully dismantling traps. But the poachers were persistent. They moved deeper into the forest, setting bait to lure wildlife and positioning themselves to ambush their prey. Jake felt powerless, but he refused to give up. One evening, while inspecting a section of the forest near the ridge, he noticed a fresh trail of footprints leading toward a clearing. The ground was littered with signs of human activity, crushed plants, discarded food wrappers, and faint traces of meat used as bait. Jake crouched low, his camera in hand, ready to document the evidence. Suddenly, he heard the unmistakable growl of the mother bear. She emerged from the shadows, her massive form moving with deliberate purpose. Her cub trailed close behind, no longer trembling but visibly stronger than before. Jake's relief at seeing them quickly turned to dread. The bears were heading toward the clearing, unaware of the danger that awaited them. Without thinking, Jake threw a rock toward the opposite side of the clearing, creating a loud noise that echoed through the trees. The poachers, startled, turned their attention toward the sound, their weapons raised. Jake used the distraction to move closer to the bears, waving his arms in the air to silently guide them away from the trap. The mother bear paused, her sharp eyes locking onto Jake. For a moment, he wasn't sure if she would trust him again. But then, as if sensing his intentions, she nudged her cub and retreated into the safety of the trees. Jake exhaled, his heart pounding. The poachers, frustrated by their failed attempt, regrouped. Jake followed them from a safe distance, documenting their every move. His camera captured everything: the traps they set, the destruction they left behind, and their blatant disregard for the fragile ecosystem they were exploiting. Back at his cabin, Jake shared the evidence with Sarah, who immediately contacted the local wildlife protection agency. But their response was hesitant, without more concrete proof. They were reluctant to take action. Frustrated but determined, Jake realized he couldn't rely on authorities alone. The forest needed more than distant bureaucracy, it needed immediate action. He and Sarah devised a plan to outwit the poachers. They set up camera traps near known poaching hotspots, using natural markers like overturned rocks and clawed tree trunks to guide the bears away from danger. The mother bear, as if understanding the urgency, began cooperating in subtle ways. She led Jake to areas where the poachers had been active, her movements deliberate and precise. Together, man and beast formed an unlikely alliance, each playing their part to protect the forest. One night, while reviewing footage from the camera traps, Jake felt a surge of hope. The images captured the poachers in action, laying bait, checking traps, and carrying weapons. It was irrefutable evidence. With Sarah's help, Jake presented the footage to the authorities, leaving no room for doubt. The following morning, reinforcements arrived, their presence a powerful deterrent to the poachers. But Jake knew this wasn't the end. The forest remained vulnerable, its fragile beauty a constant target for those who sought to exploit it. As he stood on the porch of his cabin that evening, Jake's thoughts turned to the bears. He knew their trust had been hard-earned, a gift he didn't take lightly. The wilderness had given him a purpose, and he was determined to honor it. For the first time in days, the forest felt alive again, its quiet hum of life a reminder of what was worth protecting. And somewhere in the distance, Jake imagined the mother bear watching, her cub safe at her side. As if to say, "Thank you." The following week, as Jake continued his efforts to protect the forest, an unexpected discovery deepened his connection to the wilderness. He was hiking along a less traveled trail near the ridge, scouting for any lingering signs of the poachers, when he stumbled upon something extraordinary. The trail led to a cluster of large boulders partially obscured by dense undergrowth. As Jake cleared the foliage, he noticed a narrow cave entrance, hidden and almost deliberately concealed by the natural landscape. A faint breeze whispered from within, cool against his face, and he hesitated before stepping inside. The cave was small but awe-inspiring. As Jake's flashlight illuminated the walls, intricate markings revealed themselves, etched deeply into the stone. The drawings were simple yet striking, figures of bears standing beside humans, their shapes intertwined in what appeared to be acts of protection and harmony. Surrounding them were symbols of the forest, trees, rivers, and other animals, all connected by flowing patterns that seemed to tell a story of balance and unity. One image captured Jake's attention more than the others, a carving of a man holding out his hand to a bear cub, with a larger bear standing watchful in the background. The figures exuded an ancient wisdom, as though they had been waiting centuries to be found. In the center of the chamber lay a small, carved stone. Jake picked it up carefully, its smooth surface cool in his hands. The carving on the stone mirrored the wall's imagery: a man, a cub, and a bear, and as he held it, he felt a strange warmth emanating from within. It wasn't just an artifact, it felt alive, as if imbued with the energy of the forest itself. Jake sat in the cave for hours, his mind racing. The carvings seemed to speak of a bond between humans and nature, a sacred connection that demanded respect and care. He couldn't shake the feeling that the discovery was more than chance, that it was meant for him to find. Back at his cabin, Jake contacted Sarah to share what he had uncovered. When she arrived and saw the stone and the photos of the cave, her expression shifted from amazement to deep seriousness. "You found something extraordinary," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Sarah explained that local legends spoke of protector bears, chosen by the spirit of the forest to safeguard the land and its inhabitants. According to the stories, these bears acted as guardians, defending the wilderness from harm and guiding those who showed them kindness. The carvings in the cave, she believed, were a testament to this legend, a physical record of a bond that had existed for generations. Jake was skeptical at first, but the more he thought about his experiences, the mother bear's trust, her subtle guidance, and now this discovery, the more the pieces seemed to fit. The carved stone felt less like a relic and more like a talisman, a symbol of the relationship he had formed with the bears and the forest. Days later, the mother bear returned, her cub now stronger and more confident. Jake watched from a respectful distance as they moved through the forest, their presence as majestic as ever. This time, the bear stopped and looked directly at him, her gaze calm and steady. It was the same look she had given him after the rescue, a silent acknowledgement that filled Jake with both pride and humility, guided by an unspoken understanding. The bears led Jake to a clearing he had never seen before. The space was alive with vibrant plants, some so rare they felt otherworldly. Among them was a small cluster of golden-leaved plants with delicate white blossoms. Jake instinctively knew these were special. He photographed them, documenting their location, before returning to his cabin to research their significance. When Sarah examined the photos, her excitement was palpable. The plant, she explained, resembled one long thought extinct, rumored in ancient folklore to hold powerful medicinal properties. Its potential could be groundbreaking, not only for the local ecosystem but for treating diseases that modern medicine struggled to combat. As news of Jake's discovery spread among the conservation community, attention turned to the forest. Scientists, herbalists, and environmentalists began studying the plant under strict protection, ensuring its survival while exploring its benefits. Jake's cabin became a hub for these efforts. A place where people gathered to learn, collaborate, and share their love for the wilderness. But Jake's heart remained tethered to the bears. He couldn't ignore the role they had played in leading him to the cave and the rare plant. It was as if they had chosen him, trusted him to carry their story forward. The carved stone now sat on Jake's desk, its presence a constant reminder of the forest's mysteries and its fragile balance. Though the bears continued to live in the wild, their bond with Jake was undeniable. It wasn't a connection born of ownership or dominance, but of mutual respect, a partnership between man and nature that carried a profound lesson. To protect the world we share, we must first learn to understand it. For Jake, the stone was not just a relic of the past, it was a symbol of hope for the future. And he knew that the journey it had started was far from over. The discovery of the carved stone and the rare plant marked a turning point in Jake's journey. What began as a personal retreat into the wilderness had transformed into a mission to protect and preserve it. The forest, once a quiet sanctuary for Jake, had become a battleground of resilience, a fragile ecosystem under threat but also capable of immense healing. Jake spent weeks collaborating with conservationists, scientists, and local authorities. The rare plant, now carefully cultivated under strict supervision, revealed groundbreaking medicinal properties. Early studies suggested it could treat a rare disease affecting both wildlife and humans. Jake marveled at how something so small, hidden within the depths of the forest, could hold the potential to save lives. But not everyone shared his reverence for the discovery. Word of the plant's value attracted the attention of the poachers who had been thwarted earlier. This time, they returned with reinforcements, armed with more sophisticated tools and a ruthless determination to exploit the forest's treasures. Jake noticed signs of their presence almost immediately. Traps reappeared in areas once cleared, and trails showed signs of heavy activity. The poachers were working quickly and methodically, setting their sights on the plant's habitat and the bears that had led Jake to it. Frustration and anger boiled within Jake. He couldn't let this happen, not to the bears, not to the forest. He reached out to Sarah, who shared his concerns. Together, they devised a plan to protect the forest. It was risky, but it was the only way to stop the poachers before irreparable damage was done. With Sarah coordinating from the town, Jake ventured deep into the forest, setting up camera traps and leaving decoy trails to mislead the poachers. The mother bear seemed to sense the danger as well. She began appearing more frequently, her movements deliberate as she guided her cub away from areas where traps had been set. One evening, as Jake patrolled a clearing, he saw the poachers setting up a crude ambush near the rare plants. His heart pounded as he crouched low in the underbrush, documenting their activities with his camera. The sight of them trampling over the delicate ecosystem filled him with a mix of rage and despair. Suddenly, a deep growl echoed through the trees. The mother bear emerged from the shadows, her massive frame moving with a slow, deliberate menace. The poachers froze, their weapons trembling in their hands. Jake held his breath, watching as the bear's presence alone was enough to drive two of the poachers scrambling back into the forest. But the others held their ground, emboldened by their numbers. Jake knew he couldn't remain a passive observer. Summoning his courage, he threw a rock toward a nearby thicket, creating a distraction that sent the poachers spinning in confusion. The bear, taking advantage of the chaos, growled once more and advanced, her sheer presence enough to force the remaining men to retreat. As the poachers fled, Jake emerged from his hiding spot, his heart still pounding. He glanced at the mother bear, who stood motionless, her dark eyes meeting his. There was no hostility in her gaze, only calm, steady recognition. Her cub appeared moments later, peeking out from behind her. Jake felt a wave of gratitude and relief as they retreated back into the forest. Safe for now. But Jake knew the fight wasn't over. The next morning, Jake called a town meeting, sharing his evidence and the story of the protector bears. At first, some were skeptical. dismissing his claims as exaggerated. But when Jake presented the carved stone and the footage of the poachers, the mood shifted. Sarah spoke passionately about the need to protect the forest, emphasizing the plant's potential to save lives and the bear's role in maintaining the ecosystem. Slowly, the community began to rally. Volunteers formed patrols to monitor the forest, while local officials increased enforcement efforts. Jake felt a surge of hope as families joined the cause. Children planting trees and building wildlife shelters. The forest, once overlooked by many, was becoming a symbol of unity and pride. Meanwhile, the mother bear continued to watch over the forest. Her presence a quiet but powerful reminder of the connection between man and nature. Jake often saw her from a distance, her cub now stronger and more independent. Each sighting filled him with a mix of awe and gratitude, a reminder of the bond they had forged. Months later, the poachers were apprehended, their plans to exploit the forest thwarted. The rare plant, now thriving under careful cultivation, began to be used in medical treatments, saving lives across the region. Jake's story and the story of the protector bears spread far beyond their small community, inspiring conservation efforts around the world. For Jake, the carved stone remained a constant reminder of the lessons he had learned. The forest had taught him that strength wasn't just about power but about connection, empathy, and the willingness to protect what matters most. On quiet evenings, Jake would sit on the porch of his cabin, gazing at the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon. He knew his journey wasn't over. The wilderness still held its secrets, its challenges, and its beauty. But as long as he drew breath, Jake was determined to stand as a guardian of the forest, just as the bears had taught him to be. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the forest in hues of gold and amber, Jake stood at the edge of his cabin porch, reflecting on the journey that had changed his life. The wilderness had taught him lessons he never expected of courage, empathy, and the unbreakable bond between humans and nature. The carved stone rested on his desk, a glowing reminder of the guardian bears and the legacy they had entrusted to him. The forest, once a battleground, was now thriving. The bears, though unseen in recent weeks, remained a part of him, their silent presence woven into the rhythms of the wild. Jake knew his mission wasn't over. The forest still needed its protectors, and he vowed to continue his work, inspiring others to cherish and defend the natural world. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales.